There's a particular kind of loneliness that the desert manufactures specially, not the loneliness of a crowd, or of a quiet house, or even of a graveyard at dusk. It's the loneliness of open space, of sky that goes on past the point where your eyes can find an edge, of silence so complete it starts to sound like something. A pressure behind the ears, a hum you can't locate. Elias Cord had been living inside that loneliness for 11 months when the puppy found him. I say found him deliberately, because that's what happened, not the other way around. I was camped maybe 40 yards east of Elias' property line the morning it occurred. I keep a field log, a habit my grandfather pressed into me, and I'd been documenting the way certain barrel cacti lean southeast in the Sonoran heat, which is either fascinating science or the sign of a man with too much time and not enough purpose. I hadn't spoken to Elias more than twice since arriving in the area. He wasn't unfriendly, exactly. He was just closed. A door that had been shut so long the hinges had started to rust from the inside. What I'm going to tell you happened over 3 weeks in July. It involves a man who had methodically given away or lost almost everything he'd once considered worth keeping. His marriage, his herd, his reputation in town, most of his money, and somewhere along the line, the habit of caring whether tomorrow arrived or not. And it involves a puppy, 8, maybe 9 weeks old, ribs you could count from 10 feet, eyes like polished amber, enormous in a face too small to hold them, blinking out at a world that had, by every measurable standard, already failed her. She walked out of the desert at the worst possible time, into the worst possible situation, and picked the one man in the county least equipped to save anything. I've been trying to figure out ever since whether she made a mistake. I don't think she did. The morning she came, the temperature had already hit 94 by 7 a.m. I know that because I'd written it in my log, 794 degrees F, wind from the southwest, dry as a bone, and then I'd set the notebook down to pour water from my canteen and noticed Elias out near his fence line. He was crouched in the dirt, doing something with his hands, and from my angle I couldn't make out what. His truck was pulled up crooked behind him, the driver's door hanging open the way it does when a man stops the engine in the middle of a thought and forgets to finish it. The engine was still ticking as it cooled. I watched him for a moment, not out of nosiness, or not entirely. Mostly because in 11 months I'd never once seen Elias Cord crouch down like that. He moved through his days with a deliberate verticality, as if staying upright required continuous conscious effort. The kind of posture that isn't about confidence. It's about not letting yourself go. He stayed crouched for a long time. Then he stood up slowly, turned, and looked directly at me across the 40 yards of rock and scrub between us. His face did something complicated. He raised one hand, not quite a wave, more like an acknowledgement, and then looked back down at whatever was in the dirt. I walked over. She was curled against the base of a fence post, pressed into the small shadow it threw, which at that hour was about the size of a dinner plate. That shadow was the only shade within 20 yards in any direction, and she'd found it. That was the first thing that struck me, the precision of her survival instinct, even half dead. She'd found the exact right spot. She was a cattle-dog mix, I thought, though it was hard to be certain. The merle patterning was there, faint under the dust, and the ears had the wide, slightly oversized set of an Australian shepherd. But she was so thin the breed markers were blurred. Her coat was matted along her belly and flanks, stuck with cactus spines that had been partially worked out by her own teeth, I realized, looking at the pattern. She'd been pulling at them herself. The effort of it showed in the way she held her right foreleg, bent at an angle that suggested exhaustion rather than injury, though I couldn't be sure yet. Her eyes were open, that was the thing. She was clearly at the edge of what she could endure, and her eyes were open, watching Elias with an expression I would have said was impossible on an animal that young, if I hadn't seen it myself. Assessing, not pleading, assessing. She just walked up, Elias said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man describing something he doesn't yet know how to categorize. I was checking the post. The wire's been pulling it loose, and I looked down and there she was. How long has she been out here, you think? He exhaled slowly through his nose. Long enough. He didn't touch her yet. I noticed that. He was looking at her the way you look at something you want very much not to want, the sidelong attention, the jaw set a little too deliberately. He was doing the calculation I recognized because I'd seen him do it with other things. The south pasture he'd sold, The horse trailer that sat rusting behind the barn because there were no horses left to haul. The calculation of what it would cost to care about one more thing. "She needs water," I said. "I know she does." Neither of us moved for a moment. The wind came through, carrying the smell of creosote and something drier underneath, the mineral smell the desert floor gives off when the heat gets serious. The puppy watched Elias. She'd stopped watching me almost immediately. Whatever she was reading in him, she decided he was the relevant variable. He turned back to his truck. I thought for just a moment that he was going to get in it and drive away. I'm being honest here, because I think honesty matters when you're writing down what actually happened versus what you wish had happened. I thought he might drive away. Instead, he reached behind the seat and pulled out a dented aluminum water bowl, the kind ranchers keep for working dogs, and a half-gallon jug of water he'd been using to fill the bowl at the fence line. He walked back, set the bowl down about 2 feet from her face and poured, careful, not too much at once. She didn't move immediately. She looked at the bowl, looked at him, looked at the bowl again. Then she dragged herself forward on her belly, that right foreleg still tucked, compensation for something, and drank. She drank like drinking was a decision, not a reflex. Measured. 3 swallows, then a pause to look up at him. 5 swallows, another pause, as if she was checking between each effort whether he was still there. He crouched back down in the dirt, elbows on his knees, watching her. "She's checking to make sure you're real," I said. He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal. "I wrote in my log that night, EC found a puppy at the south fence. She chose him. He doesn't know what to do with that. I should tell you about Elias, since you'll understand nothing without it. He was 51 years old, which he looked in the early morning and didn't by noon. One of those men whose age is inconsistent, fluctuating with the light and with whatever he'd been carrying that day. He'd ranched that land for 22 years, ever since his father passed and left it to him, 600 acres of Sonoran semi-desert that was never exactly prosperous, but was never exactly failing either. The land did what desert land does. It gave you just enough that you couldn't leave, and never quite enough that you could stop worrying. His wife, Clara, had left the previous September. Not acrimoniously, that was the strange part of it, as far as I understood from the few things he'd said. She'd left quietly, the way things leave when they've been leaving for a long time before the actual departure. She went back to her people in New Mexico. They'd had no children, which Elias had never talked about directly, but which sat in the air of every conversation I'd had with him like a piece of furniture you keep accidentally walking into in the dark. The cattle were a different story. Bovine respiratory disease had moved through the herd the previous winter, 18 months before I arrived, and he'd lost 60% of his animals in 6 weeks. The remaining 40% he'd sold to cover emergency veterinary costs and a loan that had come due at exactly the wrong moment, the kind of financial timing that feels personal even when it isn't. He'd kept 3 cows, more out of stubbornness than strategy. They grazed the north pasture now, 3 brown backs visible in the distance most mornings, the last evidence that this had once been a working cattle operation. He kept the land going through odd jobs, through the residual income from leasing his water rights, through the sale of the hay he grew in the east field. He wasn't destitute, but he was close enough to it that he could see it from where he stood, the way you can see a storm front building on the horizon and know exactly what it's going to do when it gets to you. The thing about Elias, the thing that took me a while to understand, was that the material losses weren't the worst of it. The worst of it was that he'd stopped having opinions about his own future. Not in a dramatic way, he wasn't in crisis, wasn't reckless, wasn't the kind of man who picks up a bottle and constructs a mythology around his own ruin. He was just indifferent to what happened next, to what tomorrow looked like. He did his work because the work needed doing, and he went to bed because it got dark, and he got up because it got light, and somewhere in the past year the connective tissue between those facts had dissolved. I'd recognized it because I'd been close to it myself, once, after my own series of events that I won't detail here because this isn't my story. But I knew the geography of that particular interior country, and I could see Elias moving through it the way you can sometimes recognize a neighborhood even when you've only been there once, years ago, in the dark. The puppy had picked him anyway. He named her on the 3rd day. I know because he told me, or didn't tell me exactly, but used the name in conversation, which amounted to the same thing. Dusty drank almost a full bowl this morning, he said, standing at my camp with his hands in his back pockets, his hat pulled low against the sun. His voice was casual, the kind of casualness that requires effort. Ate about half the food I put out. I looked up from my notes. Dusty, she's the color of the ground. She is, I agreed, and went back to writing, because I'd learned that looking directly at Elias Cord when he was doing something important caused him to stop doing it. In those first 3 days, he'd been methodical about her in the way he was methodical about everything, clinical, even. He'd driven the 40 miles into Benson and come back with a bag of puppy kibble, a tube of antiseptic and tweezers for the remaining cactus spines. He'd worked them out one by one that first evening, sitting in the dirt outside his barn, the puppy on a piece of canvas tarp in his lap, her eyes half closed. She'd flinched at the pain of each spine but hadn't snapped at him. Hadn't even tried. She trusts you, I'd said, watching from nearby. She doesn't know me well enough to trust me, he said, extracting a spine from near her right shoulder with careful, precise pressure. She's just too tired to fight. I'd written that down too, though I hadn't shown him. The right foreleg had turned out to be a minor issue, a small laceration on the pad, already scabbing over, that had changed her gait as a protective measure. He'd cleaned it, wrapped it loosely. By the second day she was using it again, tentatively, the way you test a step you're not sure will hold. What he couldn't fix as easily was the weight. She ate what he put in front of her, but with a controlled carefulness. Still those measured pauses, still those amber eyes tracking up to his face between swallows, as if the rules of abundance hadn't yet been established. As if she was still operating on the assumption that the food could disappear at any moment, so it was better not to trust it entirely. He let her sleep in the barn, on a folded saddle blanket in the corner where the light came through a gap in the wall in the late afternoon, a warm bar of gold that moved across the floor as the day progressed. She found it every afternoon. She'd position herself in it with the same precision she'd used to find the fence post's shadow, exact, instinctive, without excess. She's smart, Elias said on the third day after using her name. Yes, I said. More than I expected. I let that sit without comment, because what he was really saying was that he'd expected less, had prepared himself for less, and was now recalculating. On the 5th day, something happened that I've thought about almost every day since. I was at the east end of his property, where the fence line runs along an arroyo, dry now, but with the marks of recent water flow in the carved banks. I'd asked Elias if I could walk his land to document the vegetation patterns, and he'd shrugged in a way that meant yes without requiring him to invest in the word. I had my notebook. I was crouched down looking at the root system of Apollo Verde when I heard him behind me. He was about 30 yards up the slope, not walking toward me, just standing. He had his hat in his hand, which was unusual. Elias wore his hat the way some people wear their expressions, as protection from being read too clearly. His hair was damp against his forehead. He was looking at the arroyo, and his lips were moving slightly, not speech, more like the aftermath of thought. Dusty was sitting beside him. She'd followed him out here, apparently, and she was sitting on his left side, close enough that her shoulder touched the outside of his left boot. Not leaning, just touching. A point of contact, deliberate and minimal, the way you keep a hand on a wall in the dark. He looked down at her after a moment, and she looked up at him, and that exchange lasted maybe 4 seconds. And I turned back to the Apollo Verde because I felt very strongly that I was witnessing something that required the dignity of not being observed. I wrote nothing in my log about it. Some things resist documentation. By the end of the first week, she was sleeping inside. He hadn't announced this. I'd come over one evening to return a wrench I'd borrowed, and she'd met me at the screen door, not barking, just standing there, looking at me with calm authority, as if her position in the domestic geography had been established, and this was simply information she was conveying. Behind her, inside the house, I could see the corner of the kitchen and the edge of a dog bed I hadn't seen before. One of the cedar stuffed ones, positioned with its back against the wall, in the corner where anyone sitting in it would have a full view of both doorways. She'd picked the spot, I found out later. He'd put the bed near the window, and she'd moved it herself, pushing it with her nose and front paws across the linoleum in the incremental way of someone who knows exactly where they want to be and is willing to do the work of getting there. She moved her own bed, he told me the next morning, with an expression that occupied the exact space between exasperation and something he didn't have a word for. Inch by inch. Strategic, I said. Pig-headed, he said, but there was a current under it. I thought about that for a long time, about how the first act of trust she'd performed, after drinking his water and letting him pull spines and accepting the barn, was not softening, not curling up wherever he put her and being grateful. It was assertion. I will be here, and here is where I will be. Not aggression, not defiance. Just a clarity about her own needs that she'd maintained even at her most vulnerable. I thought about what it meant that he'd let her keep it. He could have moved the bed back. He hadn't. The second week began with a problem. I heard about it indirectly. Elias came to my camp around 8 in the morning, which was unusual, and stood at the edge of it with his hands in his pockets looking at the ground, which was his posture for topics that required approach from a certain angle. She won't eat this morning, he said. I put down my coffee. How long? Since last night dinner, he paused. She drank water. She's not lethargic exactly. She's just... He stopped. What? Watching me a beat. More than usual. That was notable because usual was already considerable. Any changes? In the routine, the food, anything? He was quiet for a moment. I had a phone call last night from the bank. He said it the way you say things you've rehearsed not saying, about the property. We looked at each other. She heard the call, I said. She was in the room. I thought about this. About a 9-week-old dog who had survived the desert by reading her environment with absolute precision, who had chosen the exact right shadow, who had positioned her bed for maximum sight lines, who measured her own consumption against the stability of her circumstances, who was now watching the man she'd chosen with extra attention after hearing his voice do something different on the telephone. She's reading you, I said. I know. He said it without inflection, which was its own kind of revelation. He knew. He'd been aware the whole time of being read, and had continued anyway to be legible. He went back to the house. I gave him an hour, then walked over. She was indeed watching him, from her bed in the corner, those amber eyes tracking him as he moved around the kitchen, making coffee he wasn't drinking, standing at the window looking at the south pasture, coming back to stand at the counter, going back to the window. A loop. The circuit of a man working through something that didn't resolve. When I knocked and he let me in, she glanced at me once, assessed, and returned her attention to Elias, her primary variable. What did the bank say? I asked. He told me. It was what those calls usually contain, a sequence of numbers and dates arranged into a narrative whose conclusion is foregone. He had 60 days on the mortgage. He'd applied for a restructuring 6 months ago, and it had been denied. The land was not worth what he owed on it in the current market, which meant selling wouldn't clear the debt, which meant the options were limited in the specific way that limits feel different from outside versus from inside. He told me all of this standing at his kitchen counter, looking at the space between his hands, with the flat affect of someone who has already done his grieving about a thing and arrived at the other side of it, where only the logistics remain. Dusty got up from her bed. She crossed the kitchen in that careful, deliberate way she had, not bounding, not demonstrative, and sat down beside his feet. The same contact as before, shoulder against boot, just touching. He looked down at her for a long moment. Then he picked her up, carefully, his big hand spanning her ribs, and held her against his chest. She reached up and licked his jaw once, then tucked her head under his chin and went still. He stood there for a while with his dog and his kitchen and his 60 days. The town of Pinto Wells is what's left after a place gives up pretending to be anything other than what it is. 38 permanent residents, according to the handwritten sign on the highway that someone had amended in marker. 38, 37 when Bill's out of town, 39 when he's home with his wife. A feed store, a gas station that only had premium, a bar called Munro's that served food only on Fridays, and only if you weren't particular about what the food was. A post office that shared its building with a taxidermist, which I always thought was either poetic or disturbing, depending on the hour. Elias went to town twice a week, Tuesday for supplies, Saturday for the mail, and whatever conversation the feed store offered. I'd been twice myself, enough to understand the social mathematics of a place that's small, how much everyone knew, how information moved, The particular way reputations calcified in isolated communities where there were no new people to reset the narrative. He told me about his reputation in Pinto Wells once, in the offhand way of someone mentioning a weather pattern. They think I'm the one who let it fall apart. He meant the ranch, the marriage, all of it. The interpretation that made sense to people who needed their narratives clean. Elias Cord had failed to hold what was his, and the evidence was visible in the 3 remaining cows and the truck with the cracked side mirror he hadn't replaced. I didn't think that was quite what had happened, but I also hadn't been there for it, so. He took Dusty to town for the first time on a Tuesday, 12 days after she'd arrived. I went along. I needed potting soil for a project I was running at my camp, a side experiment with desert succulents that had nothing to do with cacti lean angles and everything to do with having something to tend. So I was in the truck when he lifted her into the cab, settled her between us on the bench seat, and drove the 40 minutes on the highway with her front paws on the dashboard, looking out the windshield with the focused attention of someone taking notes. "She's going to want to see everything," he said. "She already does," I said. She sat perfectly still for the whole drive, not fidgeting, not whining, just watching the landscape move past with what I can only describe as scholarly interest. When the highway curved and the sun angle changed, she tracked it. When a hawk crossed the road ahead of us, she watched it until it was out of sight, then looked forward again. Elias watched her doing this in the peripheral way of driving, and something in his face was different. Not lighter exactly, but less fixed. We pulled into the feed store lot, and she waited while he got out and walked around to her side. And when he opened the door, she stepped onto the seat edge and looked at the ground, 4 feet below, and then looked at him. He put his hands out, she stepped into them. He set her on the ground, and she immediately sat down and looked at the store, took in the smells, the sounds, the geometry of the space. She looked up at him. He started walking. She walked with him, slightly behind, slightly left, the position that would become her permanent position over the following weeks, a few inches back from his left heel, close enough that any sudden stop would result in her bumping her nose against his calf. Art Dennison came out of the feed store as they reached the door. Art was about 65, built like a man who'd been putting fence posts in hard ground for 40 years, which was exactly what he'd been doing. He'd known Elias since before the cattle died. He looked at Elias, looked at the puppy, looked back at Elias. "That yours?" Art said. "More or less," Elias said. Art crouched down, creaking audibly, and offered his hand knuckle-side up. Dusty sniffed it with professional thoroughness, then licked it once. Art looked up at Elias with an expression that wasn't quite a smile but held the shape of one. "You keeping her?" A pause, not long enough. "Yeah," Elias said. It was the first time in my presence that he'd said it without qualifier. Not "we'll see" or "so far" or the silence that substituted for commitment. Just, yeah, a door-admitting light. It was in the feed store that I saw the first sign of what Pinto Wells was going to do with this information. Marisol Reyes was behind the counter. She ran the store for her uncle, who had bad knees and worse patients. And she watched Elias come in with Dusty with an expression that shifted several times in quick succession. Marisol had a system of faces she used like index cards, flipping through them to find the appropriate one, and the one she landed on was warm in a way that slightly surprised me, given what I knew of the local narrative about Elias. "Where'd she come from?" Marisol asked, leaning over the counter to look. "The desert," Elias said, which was the exact truth and also somehow funny, and Marisol laughed, and it changed the air in the store the way a breeze does everything slightly rearranged. Dusty sat beside Elias' feet and observed the transaction with the equanimity of a professional. Elias ordered his supplies. Marisol wrote them down. The normal exchange resumed. But not quite normal. Marisol kept glancing down at Dusty, and once or twice she glanced at Elias with an expression I'd have called reconsideration if I were writing it in a novel and didn't have to be precise, like she was revising something. Outside, loading the truck, Art came over with a bag of ear tags Elias hadn't ordered. "Old stock," Art said. "I can't sell 'em, take 'em." Elias looked at the tags. He'd mentioned once, obliquely, that the cattle he had left needed tagging. One of those small administrative tasks that accumulate significance when you're trying to believe the remaining cows are worth the formality. "I'm not sure I need them," Elias said. "I know," Art said. "Take 'em anyway." Elias took them, put them in the truck bed without comment. Dusty watched this exchange from the ground, looking at Art and Elias in alternation, reading the register of it, filing it away. Driving home, I thought about what I'd seen. Not charity, or not only charity. Something more like the community recalibrating. As if the presence of the dog had provided a new data point, something concrete and unambiguous that cut through whatever fog of narrative had accumulated around Elias Cord. He'd kept a dying puppy alive. The data was visible, walking beside him, sitting by his feet, riding with her paws on the dashboard. You can tell a complicated story about a man who loses a herd, loses a marriage, loses the forward momentum of his life. People will tell it in whatever direction confirms what they already believe. You cannot tell a complicated story about a man who kept a desert puppy alive when he could barely keep himself going. The story only goes one way. Week 2 deepened with complications I hadn't anticipated, and neither had he. The ranch had a water system, 2 cisterns, a pump, a network of pipes that ran to the north pasture troughs and the main barn. The pump had been unreliable all summer, making a sound Elias described as thinking about quitting without actually quitting, which is the worst kind of mechanical behavior because it denies you the clarity of a definitive failure. It quit definitively on a Wednesday, 11 days after Dusty arrived. I was at my camp when I heard him swearing, distant, measured, the kind of profanity that's used as punctuation rather than expression. By the time I walked over, he had the pump housing open on the concrete pad beside the cistern, spread out in pieces, and was sitting back on his heels staring at it with an expression that was very close to the one I'd seen him wearing before Dusty found him. The expression of a man subtracting. "Can you fix it?" I asked. "I can fix it," he said. "I don't have the parts." "Can you get the parts?" "It's a Grundfos submersible impeller, $60 part." He paused. 38 miles from here and they'll need to order it, 4 days. 4 days without functioning water delivery to the north pasture troughs, in July, in the Sonoran Desert. His 3 remaining cows. "Can you haul water manually?" "I've got a 200-gallon tank on the trailer. I'll have to fill it from the secondary cistern and drive it out there twice a day." He looked at the disassembled pump. "It's a significant amount of extra work." He said significant amount of extra work with the same tone you use for "this might break me," when you're the kind of man who won't say that directly. Dusty came trotting around the corner of the barn, attracted by the sound of our voices. She found him on the concrete pad, assessed the situation, the pieces, the expressions, the quality of the silence, and sat down beside him. Left side, boot contact. He put his hand on her back without looking at her. "I'll help you haul," I said. He looked at me. "I'm not doing anything this week that can't wait," I said. "Barrel cacti are patient." The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile but the infrastructure of one. "I'll pay you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'll pay you." We started the next morning. Twice a day, 7 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, we filled the tank from the secondary cistern and drove the trailer out to the north pasture. The cows were deeply unimpressed by this arrangement, and showed it by behaving with the studied indignance of cattle who have decided the service has declined below acceptable standards. Dusty rode in the truck on these runs, in her dashboard position, and watched the cows with an expression that oscillated between professional interest and polite bewilderment. "She's never seen cattle before," Elias said, on the second day watching her watch them. "She might have seen cattle and just doesn't think much of those particular cattle," I said. He almost laughed. I heard the edge of it. The part came in 3 days, not 4. Whether Marisol Reyes had made a call on his behalf, or whether this was coincidence, I never found out. But Elias drove to pick it up alone and came back with it, and had the pump reinstalled by evening of the 3rd day. And when the water started running again, he stood at the cistern outlet and listened to the pressure normalize with the same focused attention Dusty gave to the desert. That night I came over for dinner. He'd made beans, tortillas from a package, coffee strong enough to strip paint. And Dusty was underfoot in the kitchen in the way of dogs who have decided that wherever food is being prepared, they belong. He navigated around her with the patience of a man who has chosen his inconveniences deliberately. "You know," he said, sitting down, "she follows the cows around when I let her in the pasture. Herding instinct. She doesn't herd them. She just follows, he thought about it, like she's watching to see if they're all right. I considered this. Maybe she understands the counting. He looked at me. 3, I said. She knows there are 3. He was quiet for a moment. They've been 3 for a long time. Right. He ate his beans. Dusty sat beside his chair and watched him eat with the polite attention of someone who would like very much to have what you have, and is willing to be patient about expressing this. He gave her a bit of tortilla. She took it from his hand with the delicacy of a surgeon. He watched her eat it and then looked out the dark window toward the north pasture, where the water was running again, where the 3 cows were, where the land he might lose in 50-some days lay in the dark doing nothing with any urgency, the way land does. She counted them, he said quietly. First time I brought her out there, she ran along the fence until she'd seen all 3, and then she stopped and came back. I didn't say anything. I used to count them too, he said. Every morning when there were 140, he paused. I stopped after. After the disease. After, he didn't specify which after. He didn't need to. He looked at Dusty, she looked at him. The amber eyes in the kitchen light, still that same measured assessment, the same quality of presence that wasn't demand but wasn't absence either. She was simply there, definitively, repeatedly, inescapably there. She makes me count them again, he said. It was the most I'd heard him say about any of it in 11 months. The middle of the second week brought weather, a monsoon system moving up from the south, which the Sonoran Desert does to itself every July and August with the reliability of a process that has been doing it for millions of years, and will continue doing it past any point of human relevance. The sky built in the afternoons, anvil-topped cumulonimbus visible from noon onward, first to the south, then directly overhead, the light going from white to a particular bruised yellow that desert people learn to move quickly under. Elias battened down the ranch with the efficiency of long practice. Windows, barn doors, the loose corrugated panel on the south side of the machine shed that had been one of next week's repairs, and was now emergency today. He moved fast, his face doing nothing particularly visible, the task face he wore that was somehow more present than his resting expression. Dusty followed him. Not in his way, she'd already learned that precisely, the exact geometry of how close she could be without impeding movement. She matched his pace, adjusted for his changes in direction, stopped when he stopped. When he reached up to secure the corrugated panel and needed both hands, she sat down below him and watched the sky. The rain hit at 4:15. I was already at his barn. He gestured for me to come in when the first wall of it arrived. Sheets of warm monsoon rain preceded by that particular smell that the desert exhales when water finally reaches it. Petrichor magnified 100-fold. The whole earth releasing something it's been holding. We stood in the barn doorway watching it come down. The sound was enormous. Rain on corrugated metal is an argument you can't win. It simply fills every available space of thought and sensation until there's nothing left but the sound of it. Dusty sat between us, her shoulder against Elias' left boot, looking at the rain with alert eyes, her ears up. The merle pattern on her coat finally more visible in the low light, blue-gray patches emerging from beneath the weeks of desert dust. A kind of beauty that had been there all along, waiting for the right conditions. She hasn't been in heavy rain before, I said, or started to say before the rainfall made conversation impossible. Elias looked down at her. She looked up at him. He said something I couldn't hear over the rain. She licked his hand, which was hanging beside him at his left thigh. He didn't move his hand away. Notice arrived on a Thursday, 2 days before the monsoon system broke completely. I know this because I was there when the mail truck came. I'd walked over to return his wrench again. I kept borrowing that wrench, and I'd arrived just as the truck pulled up the road. Elias was outside, and he walked to the mailbox with the steady, deliberate step of a man who doesn't let himself rush toward things anymore. He opened the box, took the mail, sorted it with one hand, standing in the road, the way you sort things when you're looking for one specific piece of information you've been expecting and dreading in equal measure. He found it, a manila envelope which is never good news, official letterhead visible through the window. He looked at it for a moment, turned it over, put it under his arm with the rest of the mail and walked back to the house. Dusty met him at the screen door. She could tell immediately. I could see her read him from 20 feet away, the slight alteration in his gait, The way he was holding his shoulders, something in the arrangement of his face that was invisible to me but clearly legible to her. She didn't jump, didn't bark, didn't do anything demonstrative. She just moved when he opened the door and walked in, staying at his left heel through the kitchen to the table, where he sat down and put the envelope in front of him. I came in after. He'd left the screen door open, which was permission, and sat across from him. He opened it, read it, put it down. 60 days was optimistic, he said. It's 45. Dusty was under the table. I could feel her against my foot. She'd positioned herself between us, her flank against my right foot and her shoulder against Elias' left boot, touching both of us equidistant. What are your options? I said. He listed them. He'd clearly thought about this, had the inventory ready, the way careful men prepare themselves for catastrophe. You itemize it, give it edges, make it a specific thing rather than a fog. He could sell the remaining cattle and machinery and clear enough to cover some of the arrears. He could approach his sister in Tucson about a loan, which he'd been not doing for months because of a complication between them that predated the cattle disease and the marriage, and went back to something about their father's final years that he'd alluded to once, and never directly. He could talk to a lawyer about options in bankruptcy that might give him more time than the bank was allowing. And he could walk away. That was on the list too. He said it as one of the options in the same flat register as the others. I could walk away. Give the land back, absorb whatever remained of the financial consequence, leave. Start, he stopped on that word. Didn't finish the sentence that would have followed it. I looked at him across the table and I thought about 11 months of watching this man maintain himself at the exact frontier of function. Doing the work, feeding 3 cows, hauling water when the pump quit, opening the mail. And I thought about what had changed in the 19 days since Dusty walked out of the desert. He was feeding 4 now, that was the arithmetic of it. Literally, he was feeding 4 instead of 3 himself, the cows and the dog. He was also counting them, he'd said so. Every morning he walked the north pasture fence and he counted, and the number was different now, 4. A larger number than he'd allowed himself to be responsible for in a long time. What does the lawyer think? I asked. I haven't called. Why not? A long silence. Dusty shifted under the table. I felt her lean more weight against my foot, then settle. Because, Elias said slowly, if he tells me there's nothing to be done, then I have to decide. And if I'm deciding, then I have to know what I'm deciding for. He looked at the envelope. 6 months ago, I didn't have an answer to that. And now, I said. He looked under the table. Down at Dusty, who looked back up at him with those amber eyes, the direct gaze that had never once been submissive or pleading, but simply present, simply watching, simply offering the company of her absolute attention. Now I have at least one answer, he said. He called the lawyer that afternoon. I went back to my camp and let him have the privacy of it, though I could hear the murmur of his voice through the window I passed on the way out, low, deliberate, the cadence of a man asking specific questions and writing down specific answers. Not the loop I'd watched him run through the kitchen during the bank call, something more directed. I wrote in my log, he made the call, EC made the call. And then I went and sat with my barrel cacti for a while and thought about direction, how strange it is, the way it returns. Not all at once, not in a revelation, but incrementally, the way feeling returns to a limb that's been asleep. First, just the awareness that feeling is possible, then the pins and needles of it actually arriving. He came over to my camp at dusk. There's a provision, he said, standing at the edge of the camp with Dusty at his heel. It's not guaranteed. It requires a payment, partial payment, within 30 days and a restructuring agreement. The lawyer thinks the bank would rather do that than foreclose and try to sell desert land in this market. That sounds possible, I said carefully. It's possible, he said. I'd need my sister. The word sister landed with a particular weight, and he let it land, didn't rush past it. Alma, he said, the name itself was information. There was a thing with our father, she thinks He stopped, restarted. She thinks I should have done something differently at the end with the care decisions. She's not wrong exactly, and she's not exactly right either, and we've been in the space between those two things for 3 years. I waited. She called, he said. 2 months ago, I didn't call back. I waited some more. I'm going to call her back, he said. Dusty sat down beside him in the dirt of my camp, in the last of the evening light. and looked at me as if to confirm that this was the correct information to convey. "That's good," I said. He nodded, made no move to leave. After a while, he sat down in the camp chair I kept for visitors, and Dusty climbed into his lap, which she had apparently now decided was a permissible location, because she'd never done it before and Elias received it without surprise, which meant it had happened before in private, in the house, in the kitchen, or on the porch, in all the hours I wasn't there to log. She was getting heavier. 4 weeks of regular food will do that. The ribs were no longer countable from 10 feet. Her coat had the sheen back, the merle pattern vivid now, the blue and gray and cream running together in the way of a thing that's had time to be itself rather than just survive. "I don't know how she made it out there," Elias said. 8 weeks old in that heat." "She's stubborn," I said. "Yes." "And she knew what she was walking toward." He looked at me. "How would she know that?" "I don't think she knew about you specifically," I said. "I think she knew there was something worth walking toward, and she kept moving until she found it." He was quiet for a long time. The light went. The desert did its dusk thing, cooling fast, the sky going through its colors with improbable efficiency, the bats coming out to work the insects over the arroyo. Dusty fell asleep in his lap, her paws twitching in whatever the dog version of dreaming looks like. "She could have stopped anywhere," he said. "Between wherever she came from and my fence line, she could have stopped and that would have been it." "She didn't." "No," he looked down at her. "She didn't." He called Alma on a Saturday morning. I don't know what was said. He told me later in pieces over the following days the way he told most things, not as narrative but as fragments that I was expected to assemble into sense on my own. Which is, I've come to think, actually the more honest way of telling a story, because nothing happens as narrative. It happens as fragments and you make the narrative after. What I understood was this: Alma had waited for the call. 3 years and 2 months after their father's funeral, she had answered on the second ring, and whatever Elias had prepared to say in the way of opening, she'd gotten there first with something he hadn't expected. An admission about her own part in it, about her absence during the hardest weeks of their father's decline, about the way her anger at Elias had been partly the deflection of something she couldn't afford to feel about herself. They'd talked for 2 hours. He'd told her about the land. She'd said yes before he finished asking. He came and told me this standing at the edge of my camp with his hands in his back pockets, and his hat slightly back on his head, a fraction higher than usual, which on Elias was the equivalent of grinning, and Dusty beside him looking up at him with an expression that I swear contained satisfaction, as if this was information she'd been expecting and was gratified to have confirmed. "She's going to come," he said, "next weekend. She wants to see the place. She hasn't been. Not since Dad died." A pause. "He died here in the house." He looked at the ranch. "I think she's been waiting for a reason to come back that wasn't grief." I thought about that, and now she has won. "Now she has a dog to meet," he said. She specifically said she wanted to meet the dog. Dusty's tail moved. The restructuring agreement was signed on a Thursday, 31 days from the date of the foreclosure notice. I know the exact day because I was there, not inside, not for the paperwork that was his and Alma's business and the lawyers. But I was on the porch when they came out, the 3 of them, Elias and Alma and the lawyer, and the quality of their movement was different, not celebratory. Not relieved, exactly. Something more like the feeling of a weight being redistributed rather than removed, still present, but carried differently. Alma was tall, like Elias, with a face that shared his bone structure but used it differently, more expressive. She'd spent the weekend at the ranch. She'd fixed the gutter above the kitchen door that had been directing water into the window frame every time it rained, which was not a task that had been asked of her. She'd also, on the second evening, sat for 2 hours on the porch with Dusty in her lap, not talking to anyone, just watching the desert do its late afternoon thing. When the lawyer left, Alma stood in the yard and looked at the land. "Dad would have just let it go," she said. "Not an accusation, just information." "I know," Elias said. "He always said the land didn't owe you anything." "It doesn't. But you stayed." He was quiet for a moment. Dusty was at his feet, looking at the 2 of them in the alternating way she had when 2 humans were conducting something emotionally significant. "I had something to stay for," he said. which was not quite the full sentence, because the full sentence would have included the word now, as in now I had something to stay for, and that temporal precision would have required him to admit what the previous months had looked like, and he wasn't doing that in front of his sister. But Alma heard it anyway. She reached over and put her hand on his arm, briefly. Then she looked down at Dusty, and Dusty looked up at her. "She really did just walk out of the desert," Alma said. "Out of nowhere," Elias said. "Just walked up to the fence post and sat down." Alma was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's something Dad would have called a sign." Elias made a sound. "He believed in those," Alma said. "I know he did. Maybe he wasn't wrong. I left my camp 2 weeks later. The barrel cacti project was complete, or complete enough. I had 3 months of data on the lean angles, and a theory about soil moisture gradients that I would need lab work to confirm and probably wouldn't. My contract called me back north, toward a different kind of landscape, a different project, a different fence line. Elias drove me to the bus station in Benson on a Tuesday morning. Dusty came, in her dashboard position, her paws on the lip of the instrument panel, watching the road with the scholarly interest that was now simply her default mode of encountering the world. We didn't talk much on the drive. We talked enough, or as much as we were going to. All the real conversations had already happened, in kitchens and at fence lines, and in the dirt outside the barn, in all the incremental ways that things get said between people who aren't particularly practiced at saying them. At the bus station, he got out and helped me with my bag, which wasn't heavy but which he insisted on anyway. The bus was already loading. "You going to be all right?" I said. "Probably," he said, which from Elias was optimism. I crouched down to say goodbye to Dusty, which felt necessary. She was on the ground beside him, right side this time. She'd started alternating, which I'd noticed in the past week. Right or left, depending on some calculation I couldn't follow. She looked at me and let me scratch her ears, and then looked at Elias with the steady amber eyes. I stood up, we shook hands. "She made the right call," I said. "I meant the dog, he knew what I meant." He looked down at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "she did. I've gotten 2 messages from him since. That's more than I expected and probably the right number. The first one was a photograph, no message, just the image. The ranch in the early morning, the light coming in low and gold from the east, the north pasture visible in the background with the 3 brown shapes of the cows moving through it. And in the foreground, sitting in the dirt of the yard, Elias Cord with Dusty in his lap, his hat pushed back, his face caught in an unguarded moment that would have been impossible to photograph 11 months ago. Not quite smiling, something between that and something. The second message was 3 weeks after the first. It said, "She's counting the cattle, for now, and below that I hired a hand, pastures in better shape, might add to the herd in spring." I read it twice. Then I wrote in my log, in the margin next to the entry from that first morning, "She picked the right one." And below that, after a moment, "He knows it now." I've thought about the specificity of what Dusty chose. Not a shelter, not a family with other dogs and a yard and the infrastructure of care already assembled. Not an easier situation. The desert offered none of those. She'd walked until she reached a fence line, the boundary of something, the edge where managed land begins, and she'd stopped at the first sign of a human presence and she'd waited. She'd picked a man with 60 days on his mortgage and 3 cows, and a pump making sounds it shouldn't. A man who was doing the calculation of what it costs to want things. I have a theory. I've been a careful observer of the natural world for long enough to distrust most theories about animal cognition, so I hold this one lightly. But I think she read the potential rather than the condition. The same way she'd found the shadow of the fence post, not the shade that existed, but the exact spot where the geometry of light and angle and time produced the most of what she needed. She'd solved for the right variable. She'd found a man who had the capacity but not the current reason, and she'd become the reason. The rest of it, the sister, the lawyer, the payment, the hand he hired, the spring plan for the herd, none of that was her. That was Elias. That was everything that had been there all along, waiting for the connective tissue to return. She just provided the first thread. I know that's a generous interpretation. I also think it's accurate. Somewhere in the Sonoran Desert right now, it's early morning. The temperature is already building. A man is counting cattle, 4, plus the dog, plus himself, which makes 6 if you count generously. He's probably got the wrench in his hand that I kept borrowing. He's probably got the pump making that sound again, the one that thinks about quitting, and he's probably calculating the part and the drive and the days of manual hauling. He's probably fine. She's making sure of it. In my field log, the entry for the morning she arrived still reads, 794 degrees F, wind from the southwest, dry as a bone. I never crossed it out. I just added below it in different ink on a different day. She walked out of nowhere. She knew exactly where she was going.